Okay, welcome back to the FHIR in 5. This time we're up to the letter G, and so I thought we should cover getting started with FHIR. So I know this is episode number 7, and we've covered, some of FHIR already, but I thought it was important to just do, how do we get started with FHIR? So if you're new to FHIR, great, and this is the episode for you. If you're okay, you've been watching me along the way and you think that you know enough to get started, then perhaps share this one with one of your friends, your colleagues, your family. I suppose it depends on how much they want to know about healthcare interoperability, but definitely give that to them and get them hooked, get them enjoying FHIR like the rest of us do. Okay, so before I get into the tips, I'm going to start you where I started. So on the FHIR specification page, the very first page that you get to, there's a beautiful link at the top called Getting Started. That's where I started, and it's a great place to start. So the hyperlink there will take you to that location. And I just picked a small quote out of the page. FHIR is relatively straightforward as a specification, but sometimes it's a little hard to know where to start, especially with some of the solutions that you want to create. So hopefully these 10 tips that I'm about to show you will help you in your interoperability journey. All right, let's have a look at our 10 tips. Tip number 1, this is the one I always go to when I first start somebody on FHIR and their FHIR journey. Start simple. Start having a look at the patient resource. It's the easiest one to understand. Everyone, whether they have a strong healthcare background or are new to healthcare, will understand the kinds of information that you keep about a patient. So their name, their address, the other contact details, their date of birth. Those information attributes are part of the patient resource and really easy to get your head around. So I always start there. Once I've had a look at patient, I'll move on to practitioner. It's similar in that it's all about a person. And then I'll move on to encounter, just to see some of the sort of activity kind of resources that we can use. And encounters are all about things like inpatient events, like an admission event. So another simple concept to get our heads around. We don't want to throw ourselves into some of the more complex parts of FHIR. So start simple. FHIR has a massive amount of examples. So every time you look at a FHIR resource, there'll be examples that relate to it. So a lot of people have done some great work in specifying those examples to make it really clear on how you use a resource and what kinds of data might go into that particular resource as an example. But when you're looking at examples, choose the format that makes sense to you. So if you're a JSON person like I am, stick with a JSON example. It'll make more sense. If you're the XML person, use that as your format. You don't want to learn JSON as well as FHIR at the same time. So just pick one of the ones that you're used to using and seeing and stick with that. Tip number 3, check out the massive array of data types that are available and used within FHIR. Start with primitive data types. We've already covered some of those in the date and time episode that we had earlier, but really have a look at some of the other data types that exist and what kinds of things go in those data types. Tip number 4. So we've looked at patient resource and we've looked at practitioner and maybe we've looked at encounter resource, but how do they link together? What's the join between those 2 or 3 resources? References. So we use references throughout FHIR, and again, start simple. If you understand that a patient has a relationship with a GP, so a patient's linked to a GP, then the reference between those 2 is how those things join together. So really understanding how references work allows us to understand how FHIR works, bringing things together. So start with a GP, being that relationship between a patient and a practitioner, or you can start with encounter and look at the patient's relationship to the inpatient events that they might have. Tip number 5, and maybe this should have been earlier in the set of tips, But have a look at the blogs that are written around fire. There's quite a lot. There's a link to a set of blogs that are available, the common or main ones. I highly recommend David Hayes' blog. It's one of my go-to blogs. Always following what David does and seeing what great content he puts out. It's targeted at the kinds of information that I want to know, but there's a lot of other blogs out there that you can really get your head around and discover parts of fire that you don't typically use on a daily basis, or new things that you might be able to do with fire that someone else is working on or considering. Okay, tip number 6, find and use a publicly available test server. Fire is all about implementing and usage. So when we take the specification and we start using it, that's when we really start to understand how fire works. So there's nothing like rolling your hands up and getting into the fire specification and really understanding how we interact with a fire server. There's a heap of publicly available test servers. There's a link to a set that comes from the fire specification. Definitely recommend having a look there. I normally start with the Happy server or one of Graham Greaves' test servers. They're great places to go and use. The Happy server's got a great set of Swagger collections that really make it easy to interact with. Again, start with the patient resource. Keep it simple. We're learning, so start with patient resource and just do a get for a patient. I normally get a patient with a surname of Smith, and then when the results come back, I then constrain it a bit further. I might find one with a specific date of birth. That'll give you some ways of playing with queries within FHIR, and we might select date range between one date and a second date. So a great way of getting started there. A big word of warning, never put any real patient or real people into a test publicly available FHIR server, never. Okay, so never put any PII into a public test server. That's my tip number 6. Tip number 7 is an extension on tip number 6. Working with Swagger collections through the test site and trying it out is really quite straightforward. The next step that I like to do is use a tool like POSTMAN or some RESTful query tool to interact with that test server. That'll give us the ability to check out some of the headers that we might want to use in FHIR, some of the authorization strings that we might want to use depending on which FHIR server you're using and interacting with, and really give us a bit more of a lower level look at the way that we interact with a FHIR server. It'll also show us some of the status codes that are coming back from our FHIR server. So when we find a record, what does it look like? When we post a record, what status codes do I get back from the HTTP response codes? So that you can start to see how those play out in FHIR. Tip number 8, IDs versus identifiers. I think this is probably the second most common query that I get asked from someone that's new to FHIR. Every resource has got an ID field. What does that relate to? Is that like my unique key from my system, or is that something else that's generated for me? And how does that relate to identifiers? I might have a patient's medical record number. Should that be the ID or should that be identifier? So understanding the differences between the two and how they work for querying data as well as writing data is really important, and definitely needs to be one of the top 10 tips. Tip number 9, we've already talked about data types, and you've probably seen this one in your travels if you had a look at the data types earlier, but have a look at codable concepts because they're so important in FHIR. They link through to aspects of terminology. So when we bring in things like SNOMED-CT, SNOMED-CT AU, LOIC, ICD-10, those terminology sets, how do they work with our FHIR resources? How do we attach them to FHIR, and when and how are they used? What fields should we be populating in those codable concepts to get the most out of FHIR? Okay, my last tip number 10, extensibility. FHIR is all around the 80-20 rule. So if 80% of the implementations require a field, it'll end up going into the specification. But that means that there's 20% that's not there in the specification that we need to work out how and where to store them. And that's where extensions and other ways of extending apply inside FHIR. We've already kind of seen a little bit of that when we talked about extending primitive data types, but really extensions is so important and such a fundamental piece of FHIR that it needs to be in my top 10. So I talked about using publicly available test servers, and they're a great place to get started when you're learning about FHIR. You know, you can really uncover how we can use FHIR and what sort of queries we can use and how they work. Another great way of getting started is talking to Dedalus about our Digital Connect for Health, or DC4H platform. It's our interoperability platform, and really it's underpinned by HL7 FHIR at its core, and allows us to build out interoperability solutions for your healthcare challenges. So come and talk to me at Dedalus or any of the Dedalus team about our DC4H platform. We're happy to take you through the capabilities that specifically relate to FHIR to really get you started in solving some of your interoperability challenges.